All right.
Hello, I'm Maureen Calamia, and I'm a feng shui expert, author of Creating Luminous Spaces, and founder of the Luminous Spaces Feng Shui School, where I offer online courses in feng shui, earth energy healing, and biophilic design. And today I have the great privilege of speaking with Tim Walter, who's a house healer and alternative life coach. And I have found a while ago that we were very much kindred spirits. We share a perspective on how mindfulness, meditation, and dowsing can expand and deepen the spiritual aspects of our lives. So Tim, welcome today. And I would like to hear from you how you started in this work, because there's always an interesting story.
Yeah, well, yes, and I mean, everybody's got a story to tell, haven't they? I mean, every life is a story being played out all the time. I wandered into this. There is no other way of putting it. I was never particularly sensitive, I didn't think, as a child growing up. But what happened in 1998 was that although I was living a very, very ordinary corporate life, I used to make video programs for corporations, so for companies, and run conferences and things like that. So it's quite a high stress sort of occupation, running my own business. But in 1998, my wife and I decided to move house, very ordinary thing. And we moved into a house on the other side of the country here in the UK. It was a house on the Welsh borders. And in moving into that house, we discovered fairly soon afterwards that there was basically the spirit of a deceased lady living in that house with us. And it seemed like the most natural thing in the world, and yet it was the most bizarre thing in the world also. And obviously, you know, when you realize this is the sort of the way that your life is going, you certainly start to doubt your sanity to start with. I did. And yeah, I mean, we lived with that lady, that deceased lady, for 15 years and had conversations with her. And it does sound completely and utterly bizarre, but it was the most natural thing in the world, really. And we used to talk about all sorts of things with her. We used to use dowsing to talk about anything, life, the universe, and everything, or what we were having for dinner. Anything, you know, from the really obscure to the fundamentally just mundane. It was lovely, and she was great, you know. But yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And so I understand you have kind of a mentor that you were connected with that really influenced you.
Absolutely, yes, yes. There was a wonderful chap called Hamish Miller, and Hamish Miller was, amongst other things, the author of a book called The Sun and the Serpent. And The Sun and the Serpent, it was about his discoveries, if you like, of a major earth energy line that crossed the south of England. And it was written by him, Hamish Miller, and Paul Broadhurst. And I think it was in the 90s that they were exploring that particular avenue of the esoteric, if you like. And I got in touch with him because obviously finding this spirit in our house led me on to looking into earth energy and Leylines, as I thought they were called at the time. And that straight away led to the path of Hamish Miller. And so I got to know Hamish and was a friend of his for 7 years, the last 7 years of his life. And he absolutely was a fabulous teacher. I wouldn't describe it as like an official mentorship. It wasn't like, you know, I mean, I run mentoring programs for others now. My friendship with Hamish was part of that mentorship. And so it meant that really, as I was making video programs with him, I was learning about his whole attitude to life and his whole attitude to the invisible realms and the subtle realms. And he was an extraordinary, extraordinary man, absolutely the most kind-hearted man I have ever met. Extraordinarily so. Extraordinarily so. Fantastic guy. So anybody that's interested in the work of Hamish Miller, if they Google Hamish Miller, then there's loads of stuff online about him, and there are several books about him as well. Yeah, fantastic.
Wow. I mean, what, just, you know, kind of reflecting on that, what good fortune you had in being able to have that connection with him.
It,
Of course, it was meant to be.
it was extraordinary, yeah. I mean, at the time, I did not realize how significant a character he was, or even really how much wisdom he was passing on. I just didn't realize. And I think that, I think that this is the way of life, that even the most ordinary processes, you could actually learn a heck of a lot from those ordinary processes. And I don't think that we need to learn wisdom, this sort of some of this ancient wisdom of just being and experiencing life in the moment, as is so popular as the saying, I mean, crikey, we've got Eckhart Tolle and all of that lot, but really talking about being present and being in the moment. And it's absolutely crucial, now, but we don't need to really sort of, push ourselves deeply into this extremely strenuous state of trying to get there, when actually, because life will do it for you anyway. As soon as you open up, as soon as you start to think along those lines, if you relax into it, then life will come to you. All of those aspects will come to you. And actually, it's far more effective just to allow and just to experience the joy of living and see what crops up. I mean, that sounds incredibly pretentious, doesn't it? But that's the flow. You say I was very lucky, and yes, goodness me, I was extremely lucky. But it was just by accident, circumstance.
Synchronicity.
Yeah, yeah.
The people that we connect with in our lives are all part of the path and part of the little puzzle. And I love that, as you said, just kind of open up and I just kind of feel like the vision of being in a river and trying to swim against the tide, which is what we tend to do in our lives, and to just surrender to that tide and just see where it brings us.
Yeah, it's not easy by any means, is it? I mean, it's we all want to be in control to a certain extent, and really that's what most learning is about, and most healing is about, understanding that we perhaps are not able to be in control, and that's okay, So yeah.
Wow. So yeah, that's very much a way to live. That is certainly a way we should try to live. Of course, daily experiences sometimes pull us out of that.
Absolutely.
In the moment, and really, our challenge is to just kind of refocus and come back to that. It is interesting how you've kind of offer this work about dowsing and then alternative life coaching. Can you just share with us how you work with that and kind of bring that together?
Yeah. I mean, my label, because everybody has to have a label, otherwise, we don't get by, do we? So my label is house healer and alternative life coach. And so the house healing has come about as a direct result of my experience. So literally, the 15 years that I spent 15 years I spent living in that particular house, where we had that experience with the spirit. And then what I learned from Hamish, because he was very much into distant healing and remote healing, and he was a firm supporter of an institution called Fountain International. And Fountain International used to basically send remote healing into spaces, into towns. So they would they did some notable work in Brighton, which is a southern town in England that used to have a lot of problems with violence and things. And they also worked on Notting Hill in London, which a lot of people would have heard of from the movie Notting Hill. It went from a rather run-down, rough area over a series of decades to being a very sort of prestigious place to live. And we can't say that that's attributable to the work of Hamish and the team of Fountain International, but Hamish introduced me into this idea of the fact that actually you can heal, human beings can heal a space. And when you heal the space, then you're affecting the well-being of the people living in that space. So Hamish introduced me to that idea and that concept. And so, again, fortuitously, as I bounced my way through my life, I met another fellow called Adrian Incledon-Weber, who is also a house healer and has written a fabulous book. And when I realized what he'd written in his book was that he'd created a framework for what I had learned from Hamish. So the process of what I'd learned sort of over these years fitted into Adrian's framework, and you think, well, this is amazing. This guy has done all of this work, and this is exactly like what, I'm really interested in this. I understand, I get it. So I use Adrian's framework as a basis for the house healing work that I do, which is to work through dowsing. I use a floor plan of a client. So a client will send me a floor plan, and I will look for about 50 or so section headings to see whether the client is being affected by these 50 or so section headings. That can include underground water flows, earth energy spirals, electromagnetic interference, all sorts of things, spiritual activity. There's a big area in the list of dealing with that aspect of life, of reality. And it goes into the extremely woo-woo as well as that side of things. So what we then do is to basically sit in consultation. All of this is done in association with the management, as Hamish called them. Hamish called spiritual beings, the angels, and those above the angels, if you like, the archangels and above. He called them the management. And I think that's a lovely term. So I tend to call them the management. So we sit with the management in healing, and we ask them to do the work for the client. And so it's a spiritual healing that we do, not only on the property, but also on the person. So it's a bit of a misnomer to say it's just house healing, because it's dealing with the personal subtle energy of the person as well. And it's very much about the person and the place being linked, everything, in that spiritual sense of everything being connected. When we start to get in there and assist somebody, then we're dealing with that interconnectedness. And it's really up to them, the management, to work on that. We simply hold the space for them. And then we act, we go through the results with the client. I'll sit and discuss with the client, how's it going, what's changed, has this improved X, Y, Z? And if it hasn't, then we do some more work on that. But part of that conversation is to actually bring the energy into the 3 dimensions that we exist in, the physical form, because otherwise it's all a spiritual energy which stays sort of out there in form and can't be impacted so much into this dimension. It sounds quite fluffy and woo, but well, it is. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It is not scientific. But the great thing is, of course, is that the current developments of neuroscience and the way that various disciplines of science are looking into the way that we interact with our reality, then actually what's happening is that more and more science is looking into and lifting the lid on spiritual thinking, and is starting to provide some clues as to how individuals can affect places and people remotely, and what this is that we're actually living in this experience of reality, because it for sure is not as solid as it seems. The world is not what it seems, which is a great saying. But yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. And I know some people listening, watching us speak, are probably like, so you don't go to the house? I mean, isn't that like, you see people walking around and doing this work?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to preempt. I don't go to the house at all. I work with people all over the globe. I've worked with people in Australia, and I'm here in the UK. It doesn't make any difference. And this is part of what science is discovering, is that actually at that level, at the quantum level, we have to say that word. I mean, it's used as a bit of a buzzword, but in the scientific terms, when you're dealing with quantum energy, then you're dealing with the smallest packets of energy at the very basis from which reality is created. So quanta of energy creates the atoms and then on up into structures and forms, right? But at what science and the maths of quantum mechanics says is that actually here is there and there is here. There is no difference in spatial terms. It isn't 3-dimensional. And that's that is fundamentally also the world of spirit, because we see a lot of similarities between, in completely different set of vocabulary, between the way that we can describe what happens when we're working with spirit and the way that science can describe the scientific principles of being in the quantum environment, which of course is purely mathematical. They're using purely maths, and we're using these sort of abstract, ill-defined labels to explain what we experience and what the client experiences. So yeah, so it's actually incredibly fascinating, and you know, it would be misleading to say that every time I work with a client, I get a change for the client. That's not true. It's not like saying, yes, there's this magical, wondrous process that suddenly is the answer to everything, because that just isn't true. That just does not happen. I did work it out, I think last year, that I reckoned that I got about 80% of my clients coming back with favourable sort of endorsement type comments, and so therefore there was success to some degree. And again, it doesn't mean to say that if we were working on somebody's sleep problem, that the sleep was 100% completely miraculously cleared, but there was improvement and the client was happy with the improvement. So, you know, this is again one of the things about it. You know, I talk about dowsing. I use dowsing a lot, so I'm, you know, interrogating the space of where somebody lives, as I say, on the other side of the world quite often, using dowsing. And people say, well, dowsing doesn't work. Dowsing is just pure magical nonsense. And actually, no, it's not. All dowsing is a projection, bringing through information that you pick up intuitively in here. So what the process of dowsing is really moving that intuitive information that's coming through, is not necessarily in the head. It can be anywhere, but I do this because I see a lot of pictures. That's why, for me, other people pick up information differently, but it's pulling that information through from the individual that's doing the interrogating, and it gets manifested as a movement on a pendulum or on a rod. So it's not dowsing is not about sitting there and staring at a rod and waiting for it to move. It's actually about examining what information you are picking up as you really interrogate and really explore the inner universe, because it's the inner universe that is connecting to the point of reference on the other side of the world, right? It's not the physical being, clearly.
Absolutely. Oh, so many questions off of that. I mean, just kind of a comment to tag on to that. I know we had a conversation about feng shui, and you know, where you know, we have that similar understanding that our work is not a magic bullet, and it really requires our client to be ready for shifting the energy. And some people, even though they've actually stepped up and said, I want help, sometimes they're still clinging to whatever pattern is in their lives for some reason. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's applicable to all healing modalities, whether you're talking to a mainstream medical practitioner who's reliant upon pharmaceuticals, or whether you're talking to somebody that's working in the very alternative stream of healing. I think it's still the same, you know, because fundamentally, when somebody takes pharmaceuticals, yes, of course, there's a chemical effect, and it's the flow of chemicals, blah, 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 blah. But again, increasingly, you know, you have to ask the question about, well, what's the mental attitude of the person, of the individual? Are they actually willing to accept, you know, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, it's basically, I'm repeating what you said. There are all sorts of possibilities and opportunities for healing or not. And we do regard sometimes the issues that are not good for us, whether that be a physical issue or a mental issue. We do sometimes regard them as old friends. If we've had them as part, you know, if we've had a frozen shoulder for 20 years, then it's an old friend. You're living with it. And you know, what happens if you give up that old friend?
Right. Or a feeling of lacking abundance, financial abundance in your life.
Absolutely.
Thing,
Yeah.
Right? They could just have this kind of attachment to that label that won't allow them to kind of move forward. Yeah, it is. Okay. Well, so you work with people all over the world, as I do, and have you noticed any pattern of difference between different areas of the world when it comes to geopathic stress or any of this?
That's an interesting question. And I immediately think, I haven't noticed any patterns, but then I haven't looked for patterns in that sense.
Yeah.
What I have noticed is that it's sort of not really answering your question, but going back a little bit to the previous question, which is that what I've really noticed is the way that people's beliefs really structure their realities. And this is one of the things, this is why I use the term sometimes in this house healing work, and it'll apply to the work that you do too, which is that sometimes it can be seen as reality engineering, because you're basically working with the individual, and in all aspects of their life, you are doing exactly what you said. You're trying to get them to shift their perspective so that they are actually breaking out of the habitual ways of thinking. Now, of course, this refers a lot to like the work of Dr. Joe D'Souza, Dispenza. I always call him D'Souza. Dispenza, who is remarkable in what he does, and his work, goes through a lot of other aspects of healing as well. But it's all about that energy of the individual and what world is it that the energy of that individual has created, and they live by day after day in the habitual way. So no, to come back to your question, I haven't noticed any particular patterns. I find that I get a lot of work that is based around earth energy healing, but then and that's in contrast to some of the other, because I teach this process to people, to students, and what I see now that we're a few years into that is that very clearly different house healers attract different types of client. So there's a pattern in that sense.
Yes.
So I'm thinking, I've got very specifically one person that does a lot of spiritual work, a lot of work with spiritual entities and that sort of thing. Whereas I don't come across that sort of thing very often. I do encounter some quite unpleasant sort of reactions sometimes when I open up a space from spiritual type aspects. But I tend not to get a lot of that sort of work, whereas some do. So there are patterns in that, and that's about again, worlds meeting in similar vibrations. So this particular healer will work with a lot of people that vibrate with her energies. I'm working with people that are vibrating with my energies. It's all about that kind of concept, which again is a fluffy concept, because what do we mean when we say vibration? We all know what we mean, but what does it actually mean? Well, nobody actually knows what it means, because it isn't actually about the scientific evaluation of vibration, but the similarities of character, I guess, is where as close as we get to it.
I guess because I do dowsing as well, and I do it all over the world, but I haven't had too much in Europe. Most of my projects have been in North America, a little Australia, a little smattering in Asia. But I do find that the ones that I've done in Europe tend to be really kind of heavy predecessor cheese stuff.
Right.
And I'll talk to a client and they'll be like, oh yeah, well, there's a cemetery for the Black Plague, the Black Death. And I'll be like, oh, lovely. It's just down the lane, So I guess that might just be, par for the course for you.
Yeah, that sort of thing is. Yeah, I mean, I was working with somebody in Central Europe, and the instant thing that came to me was about the Holocaust, which is just such dark energy still. And actually, it's interesting because of the way that intuition works. Sure enough, when we were looking at it in more detail, she was telling me about ancestor lines involved in the Holocaust and energy of that, and that comes through the bloodline, etc. But yeah, there's a lot of heavy energy associated with the amount of conflict in the human psyche, if you like, that's gone on in Europe. But equally, North America, has had its classic,
Yeah, of course we have areas, but it seems to be a lot more condensed and compact in Europe.
Yeah, it is. It's because we're small.
Spread out a little bit. You have Berg, and you have, you know, yeah, you have different areas, but in between, pretty mild.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, it's always an interesting thing when I have a client in Europe. I'm like, okay, so what's going on here? So interesting. Wanted to ask you about there seems to be always a confusion with ley lines and like negative energy lines and geostress.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. One of my pet sort of hobby horses is about the fact that there is no real definitive labeling system in any of the esoteric and mystical arts
Yes.
or crafts, even whatever you want to call them, and that isn't really a problem. It isn't really a problem. I find it a problem because I'm trying to communicate a lot, and so you know I find it frustrating that I can't just say, right, this is X and this is Y. And usually, you know, somebody will come back and say, well, actually, X isn't X, that's W, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So, ley lines, earth energy lines, geopathic stress lines, which has been quoted as, there are all sorts of lines out there. Fundamentally, if I can sort of just encapsulate it very briefly, ley lines really are, they're all dowsable. They can all be found by dowsing. Ley lines are straight. That's one of the key things about them, is ley lines are straight. Ley lines are also more about the human sort of interaction with the landscape, in the sense of being a physical movement. Alfred Watkins in the 20s, he discovered ley lines. He had this vision of ley lines, of a landscape with a network of straight lines across it. And he founded what was called the Old Straight Track Club. Now, he apparently was quite a practical man, and he never associated any of the things that the New Age movement has associated to ley lines. So the New Age movement and people like John Michel, through The View Over Atlantis, I think it was the book, sort of started to associate ET activity with ley lines. Now, Alfred Watkins, bless him, would be turning in his grave at that sort of mention, because he never was into that. He just regarded them as trade routes. And what he said was that, yes, the land was covered by these straight lines so that trade could flow freely. You have to question whether that's actually the right kind of concept, because who travels across a landscape in a straight line when it's easier to go around a bend? But anyway, it doesn't matter. But that was Alfred Watkins. So a ley line, you can plot ley lines on a map, for example, and you're looking for specific categories of like sacred sites or churches or things like this within a certain distance. I can't remember what the actual classification is, but you can see them most easily on a map. You can go out into a landscape and find them by dowsing. That's fine. So they exist. They're there. They're kind of this almost shamanic lines in a way, but they're not to do with spiritual intent. They're more to do with day-to-day action of human beings. Earth energy is very different, because it flows like a river across a landscape, and it is actually a natural occurrence of the earth. Earth energy is fundamentally, it's a sea of earth energy. None of this exists in isolation. So when you find an earth energy line, it is purely, or what we believe it to be, is a focus or a mass of, or a deeper concentration of, that's a better way of describing it, perhaps concentration of the 0-point field, which is the quantum field I was talking about earlier on. So it may also have an electrical charge to it, which may be, again, nobody knows for sure. There isn't science that says this is exactly what this is. There is science that says there are things called telluric energies that flow across the landscape. These are big electrical flows, and those telluric currents are caused by the friction of the atmosphere as the spin of the earth and all this sort of stuff. So science says, yeah, there's telluric currents. We as dowsers say, right, there's earth energy, and there's pretty much a link between those two things. But fundamentally, we live as human beings, and everything else on the surface of the planet and beneath the surface of the planet and up in the sky lives in a sea of earth energy. So it's very much associated, it seems to be very much associated with the structure of what we perceive as being out there. Earth energy is fascinating, because it really is linked to also what goes on in the electrical processes of the brain. So when we talk about manifesting, and when we talk about doing sort of heart work, connecting and expressing love and compassion, again, in the way that sort of Joe Dispenza talks about very frequently. But you can do this, and to express your, it's very easy to express your love to somebody else, or to a pet, or even to flowers and stuff, right? But you can do it literally to the space. And through dowsing, you can actually monitor a response from that space, from the earth energy in which you live, to your expression of love and gratitude. And it's literally a number of, we call them radials, but a number of straight lines, there will be an energy increase in the space in which you are expressing that love, right? So this is a real, positive. It's a really positive reflection of your own positive state of being, right? So it means you literally have a mind-matter connection, because it's at that level of, it's measurable with dowsing. So Leylines, earth energy, and then you get into other lines that are capable of being, you can throw down what they call a chi line, which is just, just imagine putting down a line across a field or across a street. You can lay it down there, not tell anybody, ask somebody to douse for it, and they'll find it. So that's just a line of intention. So shamanic lines, when we talk about that sort of thing, they'll use those. Or you set up a line of for whatever, but there's all sorts of different lines. There are all sorts of levels within these different kind of categories as well, of different things that you can access within these things. We haven't got time to go into it. And also some of this stuff is not necessarily particularly practical or useful. It's just interesting. There's all sorts of things you can find in earth energy which are really interesting, but what do you do with it? Well, I don't know. But again, that's a whole different discussion.
Yes. And what I love is that my knowledge, and I feel like the earth also is opening up more and more of its mysteries to us.
Absolutely.
It's a constant learning and assimilating and practice that just deepens and deepens. It's you're never done learning.
No, that's right. And at this time, so in the 21st, well, what we regard as the 21st century, this is a really interesting time to be alive, because there is a big shift, there is a big awakening going on, no matter how you want to call it. It is an awakening of everybody to the fact that we are intimately connected with everything in our seeming external environment. And that's the bottom line. Whether it may, it's like we've got the COVID-19 going on at the moment while we're recording this. A lot of people are saying, oh, well, it's the earth getting her own back. And you think, well, no, it's not really the earth. No, I don't think so. I don't really agree with that. It's not getting her own back, because the species is on its path to development through individuals. As you said, every individual is opening up and waking up and looking at the possibility of something different, whether they realize it or not. And so the species is well on its way to actually shifting its relationship to the earth and to the external world. What's going on with the COVID-19 is more like a healing reaction, so that actually we've all had an opportunity to be very introspective, to face the fears, to step out the other side of it or not. All sympathies to those that have passed away and all of that. And it's a very difficult time for a lot of people, but it's been an incredible opportunity for change, and that's really the fundamental that I think's been going on with it. But I digress a little bit, sorry.
Yeah, no. It's I think it's really important to talk about this stuff, because just kind of putting it into context. I'm a big astrologer student, and the age of Aquarius is what we're going through right now. We're going through a huge shift, and Aquarian energy is about humanitarianism. It is about freedom, and it's about technology too.
Right.
Really kind of interesting how we've got that all going on in this last, 100 years.
Yeah.
It's a long shift.
Absolutely.
It's a long shift. Well, we could talk forever because we tend to. I think we need to wrap this up, but I I want you to share a few really cool projects that you're working on right now. I understand you have an online course that you're involved with right now.
Yes, I mean, I do group mentoring really to teach people the house healing process and to help them step into their power as house healers. So I've just started the second year of doing that as a group, which is fantastic. So I've got some lovely people on that, and I have warned them all because it's partly as a spiritual development course as well. You know, it inevitably is. As you'll know from the work that you do, and as what you said, it's all about learning and developing and growing. And so I expect a few people's worlds will be turned upside down in the next few months, but you know, they'll be okay. So that's always a really exciting time to actually see a group start to work together and to flourish together and to really start to understand who they are as individuals, because that's a lot of what that's about. Yeah, and then I started an online monthly meditation as well, because I've taken it. I do these, as you know, I do these live Q&As on the YouTube channel most Mondays, and I wanted to take that a little bit further so that we could help a group of people. Maybe we'll see how that goes. That's literally the first one of those is in next week. But that is also, we're going to do some meditation and focus on the external environment as well. So the more people that are involved in that sort of group, and there are lots of them around the world happening, and you know, some really big ones. This is just a small little group that I'll work with individually on this sort of small group basis, and we'll do whatever we can to do some healing outside on that basis. So that's what's exciting. Yeah, lots of things. I mean, there's so much thirst. The people really want to know about this stuff now, which is fantastic. So, you know, it's up to people like us to actually to share the wisdom, rather like, you know, Hamish did for me, for sure, earlier on. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
And of course, the book is the other thing that I'm working on. Yeah. Yeah, and we know what it's like to write a book. You know, it's not easy.
It took me 9 years. Hopefully it doesn't take you.
Well, it's possible. It's already taken me 15, but I don't know. You know, it depends what comes out the other end.
I just want to show everybody, you know, I discovered Tim, as many people have, on his YouTube channel, and was just really struck by his just a wonderful way of communicating rather sometimes complex, or can be complex, information, and just very matter-of-factly. And I purchased his book, read the book that you wrote with Adrian, Spirit and Earth, and just loved it. And because of that, I reached out to him and said, hey, I'd love to chat with you. So I thank you for being so approachable and just so heart-centered and generous in sharing your wisdom. And please tell me how they can connect with you on your YouTube channel and your website.
Yeah, well, yes, indeed. I mean, if you go to YouTube and do a search on Tim Walter Dowser, don't just put in Tim Walter, because if you just put in Tim Walter, what you'll get is some German football manager, which isn't really me. So that's not my area at all. So Tim Walter Dowser or Tim Walter House Healer, that will find me. That's on YouTube. Otherwise, go to my website, which is www.knightsrose.com. So that's knights as in knights of old, rose as in the flower. Knights Rose. So
and I'll have the URL in the description, and
that's great. Yeah,
a link to your YouTube channel. Yeah.
Awesome. Super.
Well, it was such a pleasure, and thank you so much for spending some time this morning to chat.
No, thank you.
All right.
Always a pleasure, Maureen.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.